Yeah. So basically, like I said, I get into a situation where through the research that I'm doing and whatever I'm learning about. Right now I'm very much on the rationalist train, and I'm reading a lot of things on, let's say, Masorah.org, or I'm reading anything I could get my hands on regarding Rambam and his view. And sometimes I just run into these websites that take me down this black hole, and I kind of lose my I don't know if it's called faith, but I kind of lose track of what I believe is real or not, or whatever. So, like I said, I heard you on a discussion the other day that talks about similar to this kind of topic, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts to flesh that out a little bit more, so I could get a full understanding of what you think. So you said that the text, I'm assuming you're talking about the 5 books, says that the laws are from God, but the narrative did not come from God. So could you explain more about what you mean by that?
I never said that the Torah says that. Torah doesn't mention it as coming from God, according to the narrative. There are things that we could pick up just by the narrative. Like we know that there were 10 utterances, 10 statements given on Mount Sinai. Within those 10 statements, there's probably like 15 laws. And that the whole transmission began on Har Sinai and traveled all the way through the desert and even towards the end of Devarim. Devarim is considered the repetition of the law, but there's laws that appear there that don't appear elsewhere. It doesn't say that the whole narrative that explains the 10 plagues and Noah and Avram Avinu, that all that was given on Har Sinai or was ever directly given by God. Why should we walk around saying that it was? Now, I believe it in faith, but I would have to acknowledge that it's really an optional belief. To believe that it came from God, including the flood story, this and that could have just been historical. I think if we're able to make these separations of what's obligatory to believe and what's optional, when we debate people, we could protect ourselves a little better. Instead of just going off on a limb and saying, no, the whole Torah, even the giving of the Torah, because don't forget, the Torah narrative describes the Torah being given. All this was given to them on Mount Sinai, including the narrative that appears in Numbers and Deuteronomy. It was given to the Jewish people before it even occurred. I don't know why that's a staple of our faith. How can you defend that? Now, I could believe it in faith, but I'm not going to say that Judaism is made or is broken on narrative. What makes Torah exceptional is the individual moral training that's contained within. That's it. Not necessarily the narrative. I mean, a lot of these guys don't live lives worth emulating. It's just telling us a story. I think rabbis nowadays hang too much on those stories. They're like, why is there an extra vav here? In a story, in part of the narrative, when Torah means instruction, it means the instructions that came to us starting in Mount Sinai and ending at the end of Deuteronomy. So I'm trying to protect myself in a debate and not walk around like these other debaters teach that the whole Torah as we have it nowadays, even the portions that were written after Moses died, everything, all this was given to us on Mount Sinai. That statement is stupid. Okay, because even according to the text, only the 10 statements were given to us on Mount Sinai. That's what the text says. I understand that it's taught like this, but the average Jew doesn't speak to people who disagree with him much, or hang around in circles where people don't believe exactly what they were taught. No one challenges this. But if you're going to go to a college campus and try to do kiruv, or confront inquisitive college kids, how are you going to present that to them and expect them to be like, okay? I mean, the text doesn't even say it. We can't listen to rabbis over what the actual text says. Not that it even helps the text. I think it hurts the text. And the rabbis go even further and say that even Adam Arishon had the whole Torah. And Yaakov learned in the yeshiva of Shem and Aver and all this. I mean, come on. They believe this. These are the same rabbis who teach the other medrash that all of Torah Shabbal Peh was also given on Har Sinai. These are just midrashim. It actually
right. So I'm not really referring to midrashim per se. I'm referring to the literal narrative in the actual Torah minus all the other midrashim. So let me explain to you where my question really stems from. So I ran into a piece of information the other day that really cracked my skull in, and I kind of like I face palmed myself with both hands, and I'm like, oh my God, you cannot be telling me that this is like a thing. So, not to scare anybody who might be listening, but I'm just gonna say it. But so basically, it's talking about the narrative of Moshe, and I'm assuming if the story of Moshe is written in the Torah, we should be accepting it as is, as if, you know, this is a true story, because this is talking about a person who we hold with tremendous regard, and everything he's taught us. He was the greatest prophet who ever lived and who will ever live. So we assume that everything should, all the stories, at least either up until Moshe and after, or starting from Moshe and after, beyond, should be a true story. But I found out that this story, I mean, I could try to Google it real quick as I speak, where this story came from. But basically, the whole story about Moshe and his the whole thing where they put him in a basket, they sent him down the river, and then he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter, and all this is actually found in another religion. I can try to find exactly which religion it is.
But let me ask you, were you able to see when that religion was formed? Because even like the claim of the Epic of Gilgamesh, that doesn't predate the Torah.
For the Epic of Gilgamesh, the only thing that really stands out is the flood story, and possibly some commandments, but that's really it. That doesn't really bother me so much. I'll tell you why, because there are multiple religions and cultures that have a flood story, and we can't say that just because they all have a flood story, meaning one was inspired by the other. What it could mean that is it only validates that a flood really happened, but everyone has their own version of it because, you know, it's not like we have technology today where we could all share the same exact information in the same exact way, and, you know, no story is different from the other, even though anyone will twist the story to fit their own agenda these days anyway.
The dates when these things are written are theories. Like, no one really knows exactly when these things were written. But that being said, I think that really justifies my point that this is not what makes or breaks our religion. The narrative within it, I don't think it's a mandatory belief to assume that that was given by God as well. That tells us what happened, but that's not extraordinary. Like you said, there was a flood story. The story of Adam and Eve is not out of this world. Even the story of creation could be a lot more intriguing. What makes this book special are the commandments within it and how consistently ethical it is. I'm not saying it's perfect, because there's some commandments that I just really don't understand, but compared to every other system, it's this book or these set of laws that has civilized the world and really built up Western civilization. That's what I hang on. And when I debate atheists, I tell them, because their biggest argument is that they could create a similar society if they're given enough time with ancient Greek thought. But because there hasn't been a society to rival ethics as consistent as it has been with societies that adopted Judeo-Christian ethics or Judeo-Christian morality, then we have to say that this is the best that we've had so far. Not that something better can't come down the road, but... Right,
so that's kind of like... So I think we could easily defeat that argument, because technically today we can write a book that overdoes the Torah's moral code and whatever, and I guess turn. I mean, you can remove.
That's the thing.
The Soviet
Union tried to do it.
I don't think we have it. I think whatever. Like, let's look at America, and the way the people's values are constantly changing, and the moral laws, and they're removing the PC culture. This is all just a transformation of what came before, and now we're moving into this new era of morality and what's right, what's wrong, this and that. So if someone could write a book that's just an evolution of what came before, technically you could say this book is divine again. And now it's just, you know, like.
But this has been done in the People's Revolution of China. It's been done with the Russian Revolution. People used to walk around with Mao's red book like it was divine, but they knew in the back of their mind that it wasn't divine. They knew that it was still the ideas of men. We believe that these commandments came from God. We believe that murder is wrong because God said it's wrong. While following a book that someone else wrote, who is he to imply his will on me, unless he's claiming to be God himself? What we see now happening in America has already happened over and over again, and all they leave is a trail of blood and carnage. So a better system hasn't arisen. And all these people, even Karl Marx's grandfather was a rabbi. These guys have biblical roots. What they engage in is cut flower ethics. When you cut the flower from its root, it'll flourish for a few days, but it'll eventually die because it has no roots. This is why, so far, nothing's been able to rival the Bible. And I think that's the best argument for people adopting this belief system till we find something better.
Okay, so for argument's sake, let's say the Epic of Gilgamesh is an older book than the Torah, or an older writing. So let's say they have certain moral codes on there, and throughout the centuries, these certain moral codes weren't working out. They had like a constitution, and now they overruled certain rights to mean something else, because I guess their society was advancing in morality, and then they wrote a new code. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this is a constant process of moral evolution that was eventually written down. It's just a theory of mine that eventually turned into the laws of the Torah, because it was an evolution from one point unto the next, which is why we see such similarities between these different religious, cultural writings.
Not necessarily. Wait. Every society had ethical laws within their system, but they weren't consistently ethical, or they weren't as consistently ethical as the Torah was. There is a missing link. There is no link to the commandments in the Torah and any other commandments. There's commandments that exist. For example, Egyptians, many of them also circumcised their children and didn't eat fish that didn't have fins and scales. But their system didn't consistently exist ethically. It would have basic tenets of morality and then screw it up elsewhere. No one is walking around saying that only Judaism has a system that will separate you completely from the animal. Romans were pretty ethical to a certain extent, but compared to the ethics in the Torah, they didn't really compare. The battle here is clearly the best being the enemy of the better. I know that when people like Rabbi Mizrahi teach, they make it sound like the Torah is perfect and it'll go up against everything and win 10-0. It's not like that. It's better, but it's not that it blows the other one off the water, because common sense plays a big role. And I believe that everyone is born with a basic sense of morality. It's enough to get them to ultimately choose the path that's going to polish them up. But it's not enough on its own to get you there. That's the whole parable of the creation story. Man thinking that he could be ethical without God. This is why from Genesis chapter 3 to Exodus 22, it's man trying to figure out ethics on his own. But God prophesied in Genesis chapter 3, Sinai will occur when he says the snake will try to attack your heel again. In rabbinic folklore, the snake is a Yetzer Hara, but this time I'm going to equip you to be able to crush its head. And that's because he gave us his instructions on Mount Sinai, so we don't have to figure out how to be ethical on our own. Yes, we have this basic sense of morality, but this is going to take us the rest of the way. That's the whole story when the snake told Eve that you will know good and evil like God does. He's basically saying that you don't need God. You can do it on your own. That was her inclination to want to do things on her own. And this is why it says that man will live off the sweat of his brow, which means that he's going to try to figure out on its own. This is why from chapter 3 of Genesis to Exodus 22, it's man trying and screwing up, trying and screwing up. And this is why people shouldn't try to emulate the behavior of our avot. On Mount Sinai, he finally gave us his will, so we don't have to try to reinvent the wheel anymore.
Do you believe that all the laws in the Torah are ethically just?
No.
Because there are punishments that are pretty extreme, and so that's where, like, what's the litmus test for ethics in this case? If we find ourselves that there are certain laws that are just don't appear to be ethical to us, but at least by our
standards. I never walk around saying that the
standards.
Torah is perfect, and
Right.
It frustrates me when I hear people say that. Now, it might be perfect, but I'm not able to justify all those laws. But because I can accept and justify 90% of them, that's a system that head and shoulders above any other system that has been implemented on this planet. The Soviet Union is the best example. They threw away God. They threw away the Bible. We're going to live a humanistic existence. They're going to figure it out. And all they did was murder 40 million people. Same thing with China. Till now, it's been 180 million people killed on this pursuit of throwing God away and letting man decide humanity's destiny. It's our responsibility to pay tribute to this book that has helped us ethically to where we are now. But the problem is when we try to separate and improve on what was already written, but without God, we end up making things worse. This is what history has proven. This is why I think it hurts our argument when I see people saying 100% proof that the Torah is true and this and that. That only convinces people who would have come anyways. People who just want to be part of something. That's not going to convince atheists. It's not going to convince inquisitive college kids. We have to give an account for the things in the Torah that don't make sense to us. However, an atheist has to give an account for everything else. Everything else. Everything else in life. Every injustice, all the shortcomings of the humanistic societies they promote. And trust me, they walk around with a handful of things in their pocket to throw at you that are contradictions in the Torah or things that may not seem ethical. But they don't have an answer for anything in their life because they live a nihilistic existence. They walk through life feeling like they're a piece of cosmic garbage because nothing really makes sense. So it's better to have this and live it with all the few little flaws it has within it, which may be true and we don't understand right now, than to say, you know what, I'm going to live life the way I see fit. Now, this is something that you can't hand over to your kids because your kids will probably end up becoming radical Muslims or becoming Jehovah's Witnesses. If you don't give them something rational and purposeful to live by, you're just going to open them up to be brainwashed by somebody else. So this is why I encourage atheists to at least live like Jews and give their kids something than to give them nothing. The best being the enemy of the better. And this is why I'm still religious nowadays, because all these things are constantly in my mind. And this is why I came to a conclusion that perhaps the narrative in the Torah wasn't given in the Torah, not to mention that the Torah doesn't say it was given in the Torah. So why should we even assume it? Just because some rabbi tells us, but that hurts our argument and it makes us feel terrible when some atheist brings it up as a form of plagiary. So,
is there some sort of opinion by any of our sages that states what you just said, that the Torah since the Torah doesn't mention that the narrative is from God, therefore we shouldn't consider it as such? Or is this more or less a unique opinion from yourself?
The closest thing I heard, Rav Tzadok Gaon writes in his parish, the Sefer Yehoshua, when they were crossing the river, Moses tells them to write the Torah on, I believe, 12 stones. And then he asks, how can you write the whole Torah on 12 stones? And then he says that when it says Torah in Torah, it means the commandments within the Torah. It seems like he's slightly pointing to the idea that the notion of Torah were the instructions and not what we call Torah nowadays. And it really shouldn't even be called Torah. It's the book of the law. Yes, Torah means law, but if you're going to include narrative, then there has to be a distinction made. But that's how things were taught back then. And this is why we have so many midrashim in rabbinic literature, because people didn't learn just like, tell me what to do and what not to do. It had to be covered with frosting constantly, and like with buffers of stories in between and legends and this and that. And that's how people learned that you needed someone to decipher it. Okay, fine. I think that we are way past that nowadays. And I think people nowadays are equipped to just get the ethics alone and pay tribute to a good God who made such a system possible. And there's enough tribute to be paid, heck, because the world functions. These societies function. For sure, they function a lot better than societies that don't have the Torah. It's not all or nothing, like the Torah is perfect and everything makes no sense. No, but when you actually talk to people who don't believe, they have good arguments. But what they really are is ungrateful for how far the Torah has brought civilization. And no other system till now has been able to replicate that. And that's when we have to pay tribute to God. That's really it. And it's the belief in God that keeps us ethical, because that's the only thing that's going to keep people to want to keep this law, if they feel that a good God gave it, a good God endorsed it. This is why
I think a person can appreciate the laws in the Torah, but for me at least, I feel like the narrative is what keeps us really connected, because we have because we all feel attached to this special lineage that we have. We have Moshe, we have the prophets, we have all these biblical characters that existed, and we came through slavery. There's a whole history attached to our people, and I feel like for me at least, is my personal feelings, that if there were to come a time where these biblical stories were proven without a reason of a doubt that they did not happen, for me, it would completely shatter that faith, because I feel like everything that we do is in commemoration of an event that happened. The entire Exodus of Egypt is grounded, is just ingrained in our religion. The whole Haggadah, Shopet, the whole thing, everything that we do is in memory of something that happened in the past. And if someone were to uproot that, I think that's a serious faith thing, more than the ethical portion of the Torah. Once again, I feel like ethics can be solidified to an extent, but I feel like a big portion of Judaism is our history and our attachment to it. And if archaeological evidence were to go completely against that, like let's say one day Egypt opens up, unlocks their doors, and archaeologists uproot the entire nation of Egypt, and we found not a single remnant of anything that the Torah says, then that would be like, whoa, like I wouldn't know what to do with myself at that point. Like you know what I mean?
So we have to see what these critics are actually bringing to the table. It's not that they're uprooting our Torah in any way. They're speaking about the flood story and the birth of Moses. Now, what does that have to do anything? How does that lead up or lead us to Har Sinai? Almost every great
the birth
leader.
of Moses, especially. I mean, well, the Torah goes out of its way to bring down an entire lineage starting from Adam. It just names people
but that's
that
not
we don't
important.
even know their story.
Yeah, well, any of these, that whole lineage is not important.
If the Torah brings it down, I'm assuming it's important because it's trying to set the stage for this thing actually happened, even though it may seem irrelevant. But these people existed. You know what I'm saying?
Sure,
I
they
feel
could
like
have
the narrative
existed.
is super important.
Yeah, but the genealogies are completely disposable. The same Torah that elevates people who weren't supposed to be blessed to get blessed, who allowed women who weren't supposed to get pregnant to have children, it shows that pedigree means nothing. You know, that people aren't destined for anything. So I have no problem assuming that all these genealogies, all these stories, Art Score, even nowadays, takes a story of a rabbi and changes his whole life around. Say that when he was 5 years old, he memorized the whole Talmud. I'm sure that may have crept in with the story of Moses, that would have been more appealing to the person reading it back then. But that has nothing to do with what happened in Har Sinai. It has nothing to do with us coming out of Egypt, that he was descended of this one and that one, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make or break our religion. But I understand for many years we were raised to believe that everything was perfect, everything was given from Shemayim like this, but we can't confront an inquisitive world like that.
I don't know. So basically what you're saying is that the narrative is not as important as the ethics.
For sure not. Now, clearly, Yetziat Mitzrayim is tied into us receiving the Torah, but that God cared enough for us and he brought us out of that. That's part of us receiving the Torah. A book that just has people appearing on a mountain and just beginning there, well, that makes no sense to me. I believe that coming out of Egypt is essential. Now, is the narrative of coming out of Egypt, was that given by God? I don't believe so either. That could have just been historical. Heck, it has more credence to it if it was historical. Okay, now what's extraordinary are the commandments, the system of law that appeared in the hands of former slaves at a time when people were worshiping animals and stones and sticks. That's what makes it powerful. Just like Tehillim. I love Tehillim, but I don't believe it's inspired by God. It's just one religious person making God real to other people. But we could do that nowadays as well. We should be able to appreciate things that didn't necessarily come directly from God.
Right. I'm not saying that the stories have to come from God. I'm just saying that stories at least should be factual, because that's our lineage, that's our people, that's our history, that's what our prayers are based on. That's what the tefillin we wear are based on. That's what that's what all the things, all the little what's it called? All the ritual laws are based on. That's what these holidays are all based on. It's based on our history. So I assume there needs to be some level of legitimacy to these stories. And if something were to crack that and throw it out, for me at least, maybe not for you, but for me, it would really weaken my faith. I get that you're very pro ethics and very all up and up about the laws and how it transformed the world, but once again, I feel like attached to those laws, there's a whole history that preceded it, that led to it. And I feel like it's unfathomable to me to think that the story is not relevant or important in any way in our faith. Right. I would think it's absolutely important, because we relate to these stories all the time, constantly, on a constant basis. Every single day we're talking about leaving Egypt, the sea splitting, all these things happen. Something has to have happened.
But that's not what we're contending with here. We're dealing with around 3 stories, or maybe 2 stories, that may have occurred in other civilizations as well, that really don't make or break our religion. And it specifically says, like, no other civilization is going to try to replicate Har Sinai.
So let's stick with Har Sinai. Forget about Noah. Forget about all that stuff. The biggest thing for me, at least, is Har Sinai, and rather Egypt, up until Har Sinai, up until today. That's the history that's at least the most important to me, because the things that happen in Egypt, it's my favorite parts of the book. It's the most, like, fascinating portions of the entire Torah to me. And when I go to a museum, I head straight to the Egyptian part, because for some reason there's some sort of a mental attachment, like, wow, like our people were part of that. So, like, let's stick with those. Forget about anything that came before that.
That narrative of Egypt doesn't have to come from God for it to be moving and inspiring. It seems that in the narrative, a God cared enough about a people to bring them out, to make something out of them. Does that have to come from God for it to be inspiring and motivational?
No, I'm not saying the story has to come from God. I'm just saying the stories have to have happened. Not necessarily that God had to come and write them down in a book.
I mean, clearly, there's no evidence that this happened. I mean, I've seen these Christian TBN specials that they found, like, a chariot wheel here and this and that.
Right,
okay, fine.
yeah.
There's a lot of things that aren't factual, but are believed to have happened. I don't think that's on the table right now. I don't think anyone's attacking that. Just because there's big gaps in Egyptian history of when a certain pharaoh may have lived or not lived, and it's different if it's this person or his son. I guess we have to deal with that when it arises. But I haven't heard a critique against it. Outside of, yes, I've heard of the story of Moses being plagiarized and the flood story appearing in some other narrative.
Right. So I actually got the exact date of when this book was written, and it was written between the 7th and 8th century. So that's 800 BC. That's a few hundred years before Ezra lived. So I'm not saying Ezra wrote the Torah. I'm saying he compiled it from whatever existing text that we don't know how old they are.
How do you know that?
What was that?
How do you know that?
How do I know what?
That Ezra compiled the Torah to the way we have
it. Was it not a thing that does it not state that Ezra took? I mean, well, the Torah itself that we have today was never written in the way that it's written in its full form. It was always texts that were separated in some sort of way, and Ezra compiled them together into what it is today. And then either that or the Great Court.
So that's not factual. But that appears in also a medrash that teaches about some controversial idea called Tikkun Sofrim, that Ezra not necessarily compiled, but he changed portions of Torah. Specifically, 2 Pesukim in Torah he changed. It gives one example of something he changed, that it said that Abraham was standing before God.
Right.
That God was standing before Abraham, and they changed it to put that Abraham was standing before God, but lest someone would think that there's corporeal qualities to God.
Right.
But that itself is a medrash. We don't even know. We don't really know if Ezra existed. To assume that he compiled Torah as we have it today, that is a statement of faith.
I don't even think this is relevant. I don't know if this is relevant, but like Spinoza himself, who is obviously in Cherem back then, you've heard of the documentary hypothesis, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so he came up with something very, very similar to the documentary hypothesis, like 200 to 300 years before the documentary hypothesis was even like thought of. So that also blew my mind. How he studied in depth the Torah, and he said, listen, based on my studying and my analysis of the Torah, it seems like these books were written either in multiple times by different people, and they were put together. And then the rabbis were like, you go away, you're in Cherem now. And then 200 to 300 years later, other analysts come up with more or less the same idea, and I'm like, this can't be some sort of a coincidence. Is there something to this theory or what? Like I don't know. That kind of messed me up also when I read that.
I've never heard that Baruch Spinoza came up with that. I heard he was put in a harem because he peddled panentheism.
That was one of the parts, but he also had very controversial views about. I could probably email you the article. He had very controversial views about who wrote about who authored the Torah.
But that itself also doesn't break our religion either. That these committees of priests put together these laws, those laws could have still came from God. It doesn't.
Right.
In terms of who authored it in the form that we have it now, I'm pretty convinced that every year during Hakel, the book of the law was read. I'm pretty sure that didn't include Bereshis, it didn't include portions of Shmos either. It just had laws. Nowadays, people are so convinced the Torah that we read now is the Torah that Moses put in the Aron. There's a lot of preconceived ideas that people bring to Torah study instead of just reading the Torah for what it says. That's why my faith is not as injured as many who grew up in a yeshiva system and are shocked to hear that the Torah doesn't align with the narrative that they were fed their whole life. Okay, because I know what the Torah says, but I've come to appreciate the commandments in the Torah as the most exceptional parts of the Torah, and everything else, according to the narrative, doesn't claim to have been given. And even, some historians teach that maybe Moses wrote it, whatever. I have no problem assuming the narrative was passed down in tradition in some oral form, and then it helps us get a bigger picture of what ultimately led up to Har Sinai, and then the death of Moses, and ultimately entering into Eretz Yisrael. But most people don't learn it like that. And I pay tribute daily to a system that has really elevated us above the animal. And every time I see people peddling social democracy and basically communism and doing away with biblical standards, you see that human life doesn't mean as much, that everyone lives this nihilistic existence that only their heart tells them what to do, that what's right and what's wrong. But we have a standard that tells us that murder is wrong because God says it's wrong. Clearly, that we don't only need the Torah to help us be good people. We could be good people on a basic level without the Torah, but it's the Torah that keeps us consistently ethical compared to any other system. And I don't even believe that the Torah is that perfect in itself, because I believe there's flaws in it that maybe they're just flaws to me and they'll make sense to me in the future, but I have to call things how they are. People won't take me seriously when I try to teach them something. But it's the best thing we have, and that's how life is. Life is not all or nothing. It's not like if you don't have a completely perfect system that you're just going to become a complete atheist. No, it's taking some of this, taking some of that, and seeing what works. And the Torah, as a book that has changed the world, it's really God's gift to humanity, because I know history. But if in the future there was some system that would arise based off of Aristotle's Book of Virtues or Plato's Republic that worked better, being honest, I would have to adopt that system, because
you would have to. But you would have to adopt that system knowing that it was made by man.
Correct. If it functioned, I'm not saying a book that sounds better than the Torah. I could write a book, but this is the birth of Christianity and Islam. They basically took the Torah and tried to write a better story, but using the same ethics that appear in the Torah, and they've even created more commandments that didn't appear in the Torah. I'm saying
right.
If a society could function off this new system, I would have to embrace that society if it made me a better person. I'm not saying if the book sounds nicer to me, because a book could sound nice, but how are you going to legislate these laws? How are you going to adjudicate people by a system that they know is man-made? People were more tolerant in keeping U.S. laws when they believed in a good God and they believed that the founders of this country also believed in God, than a society that they feel that you're your own God, that who are you to tell me what's wrong, that ethics is relative and subjective.
Right. Okay. I guess it makes sense.
But this is heretical talk. It doesn't really matter. I'm just saying, with the average person, I'm telling you that you're telling me Rabbi Mizrahi's going to answer any of these questions. He'll call you a name and leave, because they're children. They run away from these discussions because I don't think they actually think about this. Anyone who walks around trying to justify midrashim, this discussion shows that we have a hard enough time trying to justify the narrative in Torah to then on top of that try to justify midrashim, that say the silliest things, shows that this person has a very loose grip on Torah.
Right.
Torah Shabbat at least.
Right. Well, they also pick and choose what they want to listen to. Like, for instance, they go with one opinion, and like they don't understand how versatile and how many opinions there are in the Torah. So they go with one tunnel vision view, and if anybody goes against that because it's what they agree with, then you're a heretic. That's it. Like, Torah is not really so, like you say, the word you use, monolithic. It's got a variation of views and a variation of ideas, and it's not one way or the highway as it is to them. So anything that we would say in contrast to them is heretical, in some odd fashion. I don't know, but listen, if you ever want to be on their blacklist, I know a few people who know these people personally, and I'll try to get you on there.
Oh no, I know that. We used to be down. And then he suddenly stopped talking to me.
But he put you on a ban, no? He doesn't want to talk to you anymore.
Right, he doesn't want to talk to me anymore, but I'm not on the list. You know?
We got to work on that. We gotta get you on.
No, there's nothing. I don't know what they think of me. I'm definitely different. And I'm not a Rabbi Slifkin, and I'm not a Rabbi Dweck, but we teach different things.
Right.
I'm more like an investigative reporter and a philosopher. For example, I'm very right-wing when it comes to religion, and most rationalists are very left-wing.
I think you're pretty left-wing in certain areas, especially with being very accepting of Christians, and you wouldn't call a Messianic a heretic. That's pretty left. I would say that's pretty liberal.
Liberal to me is when I see Jews trying to justify homosexuality, and women rabbis, and trying to be basically everything against Trump, and that's what I consider left-wing. Me being open-minded about Christians, I don't consider
You're just tolerant, I guess.
It's just because I don't see it violating an actual Torah command.
Right.
I mean, someone saying that homosexuality is allowed in the Torah, or that David and Jonathan were having some sort of gay relationship, that's already... Here, for example, I like Rabbi Chaim Ovadia. He's on the left. All these YCT guys, Yeshiva Chavavei Torah, Avi Weiss guys, Mark Angel, I think that's what pisses them off more. That they have this left-wing approach that is very similar to Reform, but they're not actually breaking any laws. Because I don't think that Avi Weiss actually goes against Torah, but he goes against right-wing Judaism.
Right.
Now, Rabbi David Bar Chaim, I consider also like very much on the right, but he's the only rationalist that I could think of who is on the right. Because most
What do you think of Moshe Ben Chaim? You think he's a little bit more on the extreme rationalist spectrum, or he's pretty on point? I like a lot of...
Have you heard our discussion?
I did, yes, but I'm not sure.
So I have two of them.
Oh, you have two of them. Maybe I didn't get to the second one.
Yeah. So he and I do not see eye to eye on a lot of things, especially on how halakha is formulated. He seems to just be a regular YU type of guy who is big on the Rambam. But in terms of breaking down notions like smicha, who actually has authority to change things, he drew a blank when I mentioned these topics. It seems like he does whatever his Rebbe teaches, and because his Rebbe's not a big fan of the Zohar, he tries to teach concepts that are taught by the Rambam, but he doesn't get too deep into what we're discussing. He's not much of a philosopher. He's just kind of like a conservative, the small c, orthodox guy who's rational, but I don't see him ever answering questions like this. He seems like he'll stick to the book too much. I mean, he has his Rebbe, and he's big about, I'm pretty sure he wears a black hat. He's just kind of like on the rational side, but he's not really a heretic, like I guess I'm a heretic to Achronim. Now, like, I'm kind of teaching, it's not really a new form of Judaism, but I call it din-only Torah. Just what the din is. That means what appears in the Mishnah, because the din is not even what appears in the Gemara, because the Amoraim didn't have smicha. So this is something that he wouldn't respond to if I would have mentioned to him. Like, I have a video about Purim, not drinking on Purim, that I mentioned that the story of drinking on Purim doesn't appear in the Mishnah. So, like, if it was only conjured up by the Amoraim, then how could it be binding? That means that Rabbi Akiva didn't get drunk on Purim, Hillel didn't get drunk on Purim. You know, so what's the din? It's not brought down to get drunk. Yes, it's brought down to have a Suda, all right? And Mishloach Manot and all this stuff, that is brought down, but there hasn't been a rabbi who has arisen who has codified halakha according to the actual laws that appear in the Mishnah. Things that were developed when there was an actual Beit Din HaGadol. Anyone I presented to would have to agree. I mentioned it to my shul rabbi here. I asked them, how he felt about drinking on Purim, and I told him that it's not in the Mishnah. He's like, oh, really? Oh, then you don't have to do it. If they're confronted, well, they'll respond correctly. But no one asks these questions because rabbis today are just a bunch of yes men.
Right.
So
you don't think so? You don't. I mean, do you believe that the Gemara is binding?
No. Mishnah, yes, but not the Gemara.
Wouldn't the Gemara be pretty much a codification or an expansion on the Mishnah?
No, not at all. I mean, there are many laws that are developed by Amoraim.
Right.
Like, for example, with the extra counting for women, it seems the Mishnah just brings down 7 days. And then they added on more days the Amoraim did. There's a lot of things. There's things that aren't even from the Amoraim. I was looking up Asher Yatzar. That's not in the Mishnah either. Kaddish is not in the Mishnah. There's so many things that aren't in the Mishnah. Now, I daven in a young Israel. I do what everyone else does. Okay, but I mean, I know better to know that I'm following a minhag here or teaching of the Geonim here. I'm not going to say that this is Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is something that if a rabbi is confronted, I'm not saying some YouTube rabbi, but I mean like a Rosh Kollel or something, like if he's confronted, you have to acknowledge it's true. These guys didn't have smicha. These guys are commenting and they're arguing back and forth, right? But the principle is that an Amara can't disagree with the Tana. Unless he's disagreeing with the Tana with like a Braita or something, with another piece of Mishnaic literature. But he's not going to say that I'm right and he's wrong. But the rabbis teach it wrong. They'll say that anyone from any later generation can't disagree with someone before. They completely miss the point. Because they'll say that a Rishon can't disagree with an Amara. It's not true. I mean, heck, with the Vuna Gaon actually did disagree with the Amoraim. But they'll say that he had the status of a Tana or something silly.
Right. But we do still, I mean, at least in my circle, I don't know where else, but like we do still look at the Gemara as halachically binding. We still follow each
circles.
Of the Gemara.
All circles.
Right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying that that's done in an irresponsible manner. It's because who gave these guys authority? That's the question. I mean, if Amoraim have authority, well then Achronim have authority. Okay. Now the Rambam makes it clear that having smicha means something, that you're able to adjudicate laws having to do with finance, you're able to create takanas and gezeras. It says Beis Din Agadol Sheber Yerushalayim Chem Iker Torah Sheba'al Peh, that it's the Beis Din Agadol in Yerushalayim, that they are the Iker of Torah Sheba'al Peh. All these guys could create as many laws as they want, but people have to understand that this is not Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is just like if you're Bukhari and like you have certain things you keep that your regular Sephardim don't keep and the regular Ashkenazim don't keep, that Hasidim don't keep. And if you don't like what your shul does, you go to another shul. But the average person nowadays cannot distinguish from anything. They'll say that it's all Judaism, it's all Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the stupidest statement anyways. If they can't explain what's binding, they'll say that it's all binding. I mean, this is what these YouTube rabbis teach. That everything, that even with the words of my Rebbe, like my Rebbe Muvchak, was given in a Har Sinai also. That's a dumbification of Judaism. I'm just saying that what's considered binding on all of Klal Yisrael is what was developed by the court. That's what's binding. I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep the other stuff either. If there's no fear of being punished by a court then who's going to punish you for not drinking on Purim? I don't understand. The Isser of Lo Sasor is don't stray from the right to the left from the court of those days that rule from the place that God chooses. Here was the Lishkat HaGazit, where the court stood. It's not what rabbis teach today. Now, mind you, there are rabbis like the Chazon Ish who teach that the mitzvah, the Isser, like of Lo Tasur, of Lo Sasor, applies to rabbis today. But it doesn't matter what they teach. I mean, like people disagreed with him. Just because they wanted to wield power, but they wanted to feel that if you disagree with your local Chabad rabbi, like you're disagreeing with like Rabbi Akiva or Hillel. But that's stupid. So we have to be able to teach what we believe. And there's no way to teach it properly just saying that everything is oral law. It sounds like Christians with the Holy Spirit. They'll be like, oh, the Holy Spirit told me this, and now you have to do it. If something doesn't appear in source material, it could be your minhag, but it's not binding. Now, binding, there's no court nowadays, so no one's going to be punished for not keeping Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, but I believe that the Geula will only happen if we're keeping mitzvot in a unified manner. The 39 melachot are there to keep us keeping Shabbat in a way that it makes sense. I mean, God gave us the command to keep Shabbat, but He didn't tell us how to do it. So the court developed the do's and don'ts. So this is necessary. This existed in the time of Hillel. But all the extra laws and customs that came to the Amoraim, that is supposedly binding as well. When did it stop? You know, the Rambam quotes laws from the Geonim as halachas in Mishnah Torah. Halachas in Mishnah Torah. Even the Rambam bleeds as well, man, because it's not consistent. I don't feel that I could rise above the text of the Torah, but I think that we could rise against things like Mishneh Torah and maybe come out with a codification that we're able to explain where it actually comes from. This is probably why, like, the Rambam didn't write any sources, because if he wrote that this came from the Geonim and this came possibly even, it's weird because the Rambam writes in his Hagdama to the Mishneh Torah that there were Geonim in Sepharad, which makes no sense because the Geonim were the heads of the two Babylonian yeshivot. So he leads to this understanding that he may also be one of the Geonim, because he doesn't consider himself a Rishon. This whole notion of Rishonim that was developed later on, Achronim also. I'm pretty sure that Amoraim didn't know they were Amoraim. So the Rambam didn't know that he was a Rambam because he never called himself rabbi. Yeah, but anyways, I mean, I try to get people to think outside the box, but I still get them to remain religious and not move to the left and start adopting, like, whatever, making women rabbis, which is not a halakha to make a woman a rabbi, even though I'm against it, for personal reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear. All right.